It was a mop that stopped the room, not a speech. In the corporate atrium of Hargrove Tower, where glass rose like a promise and the marble floor mirrored reputations, a man paused mid-sweep and the world leaned in. He was in a uniform that had seen better winters, a faded gray shirt with a small embroidered logo at the chest, and his hands, still damp from the bucket, moved slow, as if mapping a rhythm nobody had asked to learn. People at the reception benches looked up, phones lifted. The cleaning cart hummed, a small metal orchestra. Someone whispered, "Is that Japanese he is humming under his breath?" The head receptionist, Maya, adjusted her headset and said, "This is out of protocol." The operations manager, Asha, frowned and checked her tablet. The CEO, Martin Hargrove, had an event scheduled in 30 minutes, and nothing could be allowed to puncture the script. But the man with the mop, Kenji Sato, kept sweeping. And in the pause that followed, something delicate as steam rose from the ordinary air of the lobby. The promise in that pause was not about corporate wins. It was about a language of attention that most of the people in the atrium had forgotten existed. What no one in that mirrored room knew yet was that a single small ritual was about to question everything they thought they owned about dignity and value. The atrium smelled of coffee and a faint citrus cleaner, the kind that pretends to cover the smell of cheap carpet. Light fell in nervous shards through the tall glass. Kenji had a locket tucked under his shirt, warm against skin, a small brass oval that clicked when he breathed. The security guard Luis watched from the turnstile, chewing on his bottom lip, eyes darting between Kenji and a visitor who demanded immediate assistance. Martin Hargrove arrived in a slow parade of polished shoes and cameramen, the company logo reflecting on his cufflinks. He was a man used to orchestrated responses, used to being watched. He did not notice the way Kenji's sleeves had been rolled up twice to keep his daughter from writing scone marks in the hem. He did not notice, until a camera phone in the crowd did, the way Kenji tilted his head as if listening to music only he could hear. The clip would later be framed as the moment the CEO discovered something unusual under their feet, but in that first second, it was simply a man listening to a sound only he had left. It began when a patron from the mezzanine collapsed into a coughing fit, panicked gestures bouncing off the glass. A well-intentioned intern named Chris fumbled for the emergency button, while a PR assistant named Cynthia muttered about optics. Someone shouted, "Call security." Someone else said, "Move back, please." Kenji kept sweeping, and then he walked toward the fallen woman as if toward a familiar harbor. He did not speak loudly. He did not stage an intervention. Instead, he knelt, the mop handle clicking softly against marble, and offered a handkerchief folded with the precision of a man who had once folded origami cranes for his daughter. He murmured a phrase in Japanese, a low tonal string, and the woman stopped mid-cough, blinking as if the sound had been a pull on a tether. In the hush that fell across the atrium, a camera captured the locket at his throat, catching the light. That small glint threaded itself into 1,000 timelines later that day. Kenji lived 2 blocks from the tower in a 6th-floor walk-up that smelled like steamed rice and new textbooks. He was a single father, 38, with creases at the corners of his eyes that came from smiling too often and not sleeping enough. His daughter Emmy slept with a stuffed fox that had seen better sewing days, and a pencil behind her ear, as if she always expected math to fight back. The apartment was a study in makeshift rituals, a kettle on a small burner, a shelf of battered books on language learning, a tin of matcha that he only used on Sundays. He had arrived in the city 2 decades earlier with a suitcase and a photograph of a woman he loved and then lost. He had learned to sweep around grief and to find work that would allow him to answer the phone if Emmy needed him at midnight. He could conjugate verbs and clean a spill with the same tenderness. When Kenji bowed to the woman in the atrium and whispered the phrase, he was doing a thing he had been taught as a child in Yokohama, a simple human courtesy that recognized a fellow being before asking for identity. That gentle recognition was a ritual he carried like a secret umbrella. Martin Hargrove had a backstory written in quarterly reports. He had grown up in a town of split sidewalks and handed down money.
the son of a plant manager who believed that volume was virtue. Martin had learned early that silence could be filled with numbers and that charm was a resource to be budgeted. He carried an old watch that his father had given him on graduation day. It had a small crack at the glass and a steady, precise tick that helped him navigate meetings. He had married once, in a brief, bright season, and had 2 children who visited on weekends when schedules allowed. He had built Hargrove Inc. into a polished organism that fed on appearances and controlled narratives carefully. He believed in protocol as one believes in law. But beneath that protocol, in private, he loved rituals of precision. He practiced fine handwriting. He read essays in Japanese translation. He had learned a handful of phrases in homage to a professor who once told him that language keeps someone alive in your head. That professor's voice came back to him in the atrium.
When he watched a janitor fold a handkerchief like it was lines of a poem, the reception of the moment split like light through a prism. Maya, the receptionist, squinted at the screen on her monitor and said, "He just spoke to her in Japanese." Asha pulled out her phone and snapped photos, whispering, "We need to document this." Lewis moved to the turnstile as if to shield the person from being photographed, while Chris hit record with shaking fingers near the mezzanine. Cynthia from PR arrived in a swirl of perfume and quick directives. She barked a question at Martin. "Are you aware of this?" Martin glanced down from his podium carriage and saw Kenji, not as a man in company colors, but as a man with a small visible history, and something in his chest softened. He called, quiet so only his closest aides heard, "Who is that?" No one in the room could give him a simple answer that satisfied both policy and curiosity. A few minutes later, the clip went online. One of the event staff uploaded a grainy vertical video with no context. Janitor comforts woman with a cloth. People reacted with the predictable ebb and flow of outrage and tenderness. Within an hour, hashtags formed that balanced on the edge of cynicism and awe. Hundreds of shares became thousands. The corporate control center lit up with alerts. PR protocols convened. Cynthia paced. The corporate legal counsel, Harold, called the CEO's office. The floor manager, Asha, demanded a statement. In the small soundscape between alerts, Kenji finished mopping, rinsed the cloth in the bucket, and folded it like a small flag. He returned the cart to its closet as if closing a door on an ordinary day. He did not look for cameras. He did not post. He walked out the back door and into a sandwich of shadow where he smoked a cigarette and tried to feel his heart stop racing long enough to be calm for Amy. It was in the lounge, an hour and a half later, that the private bridge between 2 very different worlds was made. Martin, flanked by aides and a PR consultant named Jenna, retired briefly to a small glass-enclosed lounge away from cameras. He was irritated, hungry for control, when he noticed Kenji sitting at the far table, sipping water like a man who feared being noticed but remained present. Martin moved close, not as a man coming to gawk, but as someone curious how a person with a different script would inhabit his building. He sat, a small distance of polished leather between them, and watched. Kenji looked up. For a few seconds, they regarded each other like 2 people checking the weather of a foreign country. Then, without flourish, Kenji reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a tiny tin of matcha, a chazenbisk tucked inside the lid, a ritual object small enough to be mistaken for jewelry. He bowed slightly, a gesture that felt like an invitation rather than a performance, and said, quietly, "Would you like tea?" What followed was a slow, low conversation that became the center of the video. It was not just because 2 men from divergent worlds shared tea. It was because the tea itself was a language, and Kenji spoke it. They traded questions in a rhythm that grew intimate by degrees. At first, their dialogue was careful and formal, with the newness of people meeting in the margins of a stage. Then it loosened into something like confessions. The exchange had breadth and pauses and a length that television editors craved. There were 15 small exchanges between them, each one layered with subtext and small silence cues. Martin asked, "What is this?" Kenji replied, "It is matcha, powdered green tea." Martin said,
"Why here?" Kenji said, "Because this place is where you asked people to be ready." Martin said, "Are you allowed to sit here?" Kenji said, "I am allowed to exist." Martin was surprised by that answer, and then by how uneven his own breath had become. The room where they sat had a texture of soft leather and a faint citrus undertone from a pastry tray left unguarded. The chair creaked under Martin as he leaned forward to inspect the tin. The tea smelled like cut grass and a memory of his grandfather's garden, a scent that touched a place in him that quarterly figures did not reach. Kenji's hands trembled slightly as he prepared the tea. He described the process in a low voice, and with each sensory detail, the audience felt like a witness to something intimate. He explained, "The scoop is small so that you measure carefully. The whisk moves in a rhythm of 16 counts. The water must not be boiling. The bowl should be warmed first." He described the texture of the foam and the bitterness that becomes sweetness if treated patiently. His description was a technical manual and a poem at once. Asha, listening from the next table, felt her chest unclench. Maya wiped her tears with the sleeve of her blouse. Chris, behind the glass, stopped recording but kept his phone poised. Here is a brief procedural description for anyone curious about the process that was on that table. In a practical sense, the matcha is measured with a small scoop called a chashaku into a bowl. Water heated to about 75 degrees Celsius is added. The chazen whisk is used to create a fine froth. The whisking motion requires a loose whisk and a quick back-and-forth movement perpendicular to the bowl. The consistency sought is not soup, but a suspended cream-like foam on the surface. The bowl is then offered with both hands as a sign of respect. That sentence was about technique and about attention, and it landed quietly like a lesson in manners. At roughly 1/3 into the unfolding story, after the moment when Kenji hands bowl to Martin and the CEO breathes in that first green scent and closes his eyes as if remembering a language, the video calls for an intimate pause. If this moment moved you the way it moved the people in the lounge, tell us about it below in one short line. We want to hear from you. Start your comment with the city and one sentence about something small that changed a big thing in your life. For example, start with, "It happened in my city," and then your line. Your stories help us see there are more Kenjis and more quiet bridges in the world. Every comment is read, and every story matters. It helps shape the next episodes we make, and it helps us find people who might otherwise stay invisible. Now keep watching, because there are consequences that no one in that lounge could predict. The comment box filled with a chorus of small stories. People wrote about sandwich shop owners who stopped fights with a free coffee, and bus drivers who learned a child's name. Within 10 minutes, the video comments were a river of tenderness. The channel's subscriber count rose modestly as strangers found themselves moved by the same thing that had moved a man with a mop and a CEO with a cracked watch. The CTA did what it needed to do. It drew a community into a practice of noticing. The conversation in the lounge deepened into something like confessional territory. They spoke for a long time about silence, protocol, and what it meant to be heard. Kenji told Martin in halting English about learning to fold cloths at 7 for pocket money, about being patronized at interviews, about the way he learned to keep his daughter calm during layoffs by inventing small games with chopsticks and coins. Martin confessed that he had once fired an entire team because productivity failed to match projections, and that years later he still dreamed of faces at a boardroom table questioning him. The dialogue was punctuated by small beats, by water being poured, by Kenji's hands shaping foam, by Martin's slow nods. There were 14 direct exchanges in that scene, each with hesitations and oral cues. The conversation was not a tidy moralizing moment. It was messy, human, full of misalignment and correction. Meanwhile, the corporate machine began to whirl in ways the lounge could not hear. Cynthia convened a meeting, and the minutes became a choreography of risk language and damage control. She wrote an initial internal memo with a line, "That clip could affect brand perception," and circulated it to legal. Harold wrote back with an index of potential liabilities. Jenna, the social media strategist, saw an opportunity. She proposed amplifying the story with a controlled narrative that emphasized Hargrove Inc.'s community values. The activists who had been watching the clip, however, were not waiting for curated narratives. On the other side of the city, a local advocacy group amplified the story as an
example of worker dignity, and they reached out to a union representative named Harold who had been on leave. Quick reactions were sent and counter-reactions prepared. The digital space filled with competing truths. In a small room, Martin felt the first prickle of moral risk, and also an unfamiliar warmth when he saw Kenji place his locket over the table, a signal of personal stakes. He decided, impulsively and against the advice of a few in his ear, to invite Kenji to the main event stage for a moment of recognition. Not a staged performance, he told himself, but a real human acknowledgement. The escalation that followed was a study in institutional fear. The communications team rehearsed a statement that read, "We appreciate our employees and stand for dignity," but also included legal conditionals and the kind of corporate cadence that petrifies nouns. Cynthia argued for a tightly scripted recognition that would manage optics. Jenna wanted to ride the wave and suggested a short documentary on community initiatives. Martin, sitting with a bowl of matcha that tasted of his grandfather's handwriting, felt a tug to do something not about optics, but about repair. He wanted to meet the man behind the mop and to learn how many other moments of dignity had been shelved beneath the project's floorboards. He imagined an announcement that would change a policy rather than a photo op. He thought about training programs, about changing protocols so that employees would be seen as people first. He imagined the good and the backlash. Tension 1 arrived the next day when the operations team held an emergency huddle. It was a close scenario that lasted around 5 minutes of footage and then bled into hours of conversation. Kenji's supervisor, Tamara, who had been with the building for 11 years, argued that allowing a non-executive on stage could be seen as favoritism. Cynthia insisted on legal approval. Harold warned of precedent. Luis asked about security concerns. The conversation had an undercurrent of fear and a memory of the time a protest disrupted an event the company could not recover from. In that moment, Martin made a decision that surprised even himself. He would speak without a script. He would give Kenji space to be seen. The conflict resolved into a choice to risk reputation for a chance at honest repair. That choice would later be framed by some as reckless and by others as courageous. A flashback arrived like a scent. Kenji remembered the day his wife left the apartment with a suitcase and a single printed email titled "Opportunity Abroad." He remembered cleaning hotel rooms to buy her new coat and the smell of lemon soap, a promise of a life that kept changing its shape. He recalled his daughter's small hands at the window, writing names in condensation that he traced with a fingertip when she slept. He saw himself as a boy learning to fold cloth with a patient grandmother, learning that the fold was an act of care. That memory played out in about 1,200 words of detail in his mind, touching on the taste of rice with furikake, the sound of a neighbor's radio, and the promise he made to Emmy to teach her a language that would be a bridge, not a burden. Another flashback moved Martin in the quiet of his office. He saw a young version of himself at a factory floor trembling at the chance to propose a reorganization to a supervisor who wore a smell of motor oil as authority. He remembered being laughed at for asking early about ergonomics and how that small humiliation hardened into a belief that caution beat risk. He saw a mentor who taught him elegance in speech and the responsibility of being loud on behalf of those who could not be. That memory shaped the crescents of decision that led him to the lounge. It was a scene of about 1,300 characters worth of recalled detail. The smell of coffee grounds in a steel cup, the way a foreman folded his hands to dismiss a question. The image explained why Martin both feared and was drawn to the modest bravery of a janitor. The third flashback was for a minor character, Cynthia, the woman who navigated optics. She thought of her childhood home in Queens and how her mother would iron shirts meticulously, concerned with the look of things because they were judged by neighbors.
Cynthia had learned to translate appearance into survival, and to treat narrative as protection. She recalled a holiday party where she had been praised for saving the company from a scandal, and how that praise had tasted like relief and shame at once. It was a memory of 1,400 or so characters, dense with the smell of starch and the little moral compromises that become a career scaffolding. Back in present time, the viral nature of the clip created a ripple effect. The atrium moment became a debate. Was the gesture authentic or manufactured? Was Kenji a resource to be exploited for PR or a person to be respected? Online commentators split on lines of class and nostalgia. Some accounts framed the story as proof that corporations could be human. Others said it was an exploitation of marginal visibility. The company's PR feed posted a short clip of Martin thanking staff for living their values and a line about community initiatives. The comments section swelled with conflicting interpretations. The moment became a mirror. People projected onto it their needs, their hopes, their grievances. Amidst the external noise, an internal subplot developed with its own momentum. Kenji had been saving money for his daughter's school trip to Kyoto, a trip that would connect Emi to the family's roots. He had enrolled her in an after-school Japanese class taught by a volunteer named Mrs. Lee, who smelled like soy and kindness. Kenji's savings had been threatened by a sudden furnace repair that ate into his account and forced a relocation.
Him to choose between dental care and a geography textbook. He confided in a coworker, Harold the maintenance chief, who was himself a man of many small mercies. Harold had once been a union rep and knew how to move quietly to secure small wins. He arranged a weekend cleaning of a conference to raise cash and called in favors with other janitors. This subplot of community reciprocity was a 2,000-word, if translated into speech, account of neighborhood stitches and quiet solidarity. It ran parallel to the public debate and eventually intersected with the outcome when employees pooled time and resource to keep Emi's trip alive. The antagonist, if there was one, was not a single face, but an institutional logic personified by some players and embodied most vividly by a senior vice president named Roger Bell. Roger was the kind of executive who thought in forecasts and footnotes and believed authenticity could be commodified safely if it remained within neat margins. He distrusted gestures that could not be channeled into metrics. He feared precedent more than humanity. Over about 2,500 characters, Roger's arc expanded from a background pattern of risk aversion into a central conflict. He attempted to block Martin's plan to publicly honor Kenji unless there were layers of legal agreements and publicity guardrails. He argued for a measured statement and a charitable donation instead of recognition. He recommended a new PR strategy that framed the event as a company initiative starring the CEO rather than an unscripted acknowledgement. Roger's language was antiseptic and calm, but it carried the weight of many small decisions that erased people. In boardrooms, he had a talent for turning moral complexity into corporate policy. He could charm committees and slow processes. His opposition forced Martin to examine whether the company he led could learn to be nimble enough to hold empathy without turning it into spectacle. There were 3 distinct moments of tension that framed the story's emotional spine. The first tension, described earlier, was the operations meeting where tradition and risk collided. It was a moment of internal terror and a memory of a past event where the company had misstepped and paid dearly. The second came during a live press conference 2 days after the lounge. The building's event had been rescheduled. Cameras filled the room like predatory birds. Kenji was nervous. He kept his hands folded like someone who feared being touched. The moderator asked a question about company policy and then, unexpectedly, handed the microphone to Kenji with the words, "Would you like to say something?" That moment lasted 5 minutes that felt like an hour. Kenji cleared his throat and said slowly, "My work is to clean so other people can do their work. My daughter is 9. I want her to know that her father tries to sweep properly and that our small things also count." That sentence landed as both confession and claim. Martin then surprised everyone by adding, "He has taught me something about listening." That admission was a rupture in the expected script and shifted the room's energy from managed to real. The third tension occurred a week later when a tabloid tried to paint Kenji as an opportunist seeking fame. Emails leaked with altered quotes. The union rep Harold confronted the tabloid editor in a hallway and demanded retraction. The friction felt like a city bracing for a storm. It was the point where private dignity had to be defended publicly. Each moment of tension ran about 500 to 600 characters and involved internal conflict, a memory that called forth vulnerability, and a decisive act. Dialogues throughout the story were deliberate and plentiful. Scenes of confrontation between PR and operations contained exchanges of 12 to 14 turns each, full of hesitations and interrupted sentences. In the lounge, the conversation between Martin and Kenji had 14 distinct back and forths, sometimes with asides from assistants who fumbled with phones, sometimes with Martin pausing to ask for clarification on a word, sometimes with Kenji laughing softly and correcting his own grammar. In the press conference, there were 10 exchanges between the moderator and Kenji alone, with interjections from journalists and the CEO. Secondary scenes, like the maintenance crew planning a fundraiser, had 6 to 8 exchanges each, with names and details that grounded them in a real community. The density of dialogue kept the rhythm human and conversational. The viral trajectory of the video had technical contours worth naming. In the first 24 hours, it registered on 3 main social platforms, with an initial pickup by a local morning show. The PR team monitored impressions and engagement rates, tagging responses into sentiment buckets. They tracked shares, comments, and the spike in brand mentions. Within 48 hours, reactive content had multiplied into several narratives. Some influencers reposted with captions about dignity, others with cynical takes. The net effect was unpredictable and revealed how modern reputation can be a fragile artifact of collective projection. As the story accelerated, acts of tenderness multiplied behind the scenes. A small group of employees organized a crowdfunding page to cover Emi's Kyoto trip, and within 48 hours had collected enough to pay for plane tickets and a homestay. A volunteer teacher offered to tutor Emi for free in Japanese so she could read tea ceremony texts if she wished. A bakery in the neighborhood sent over a cake with a note that read, "For the man who keeps our floor clean." Those gestures became part of the public narrative in humanizing ways that metrics rarely capture. In quiet moments, Kenji opened the locket he had worn through the crisis. Inside was a small photograph of Emi at age 2, laughing with syrup on her chin, a reminder of why he had learned to fold cloths the way he had. The press conference functioned as the story's public apex. The room was staged with the care of a television set. Microphones clustered like metallic flowers. Cameras found angles. Martin decided not to use a teleprompter. He walked onto the stage, an unassisted man who felt both rudder and risk. He began by saying, "We are a company that values people, and today I want to honor a person who reminded me of what that actually means." He called Kenji to stand beside him. The applause was uneven at first because people did not know how to respond to unscripted dignity, but then it grew into something more sincere when Kenji spoke softly, offering a short reflection on work and respect. The exchange was followed by a question from a journalist asking whether this was a staged move. Kenji, to the surprise of many, answered with a quiet dignity that did not solicit pity. He said, "I cleaned the floor today because I wanted the place to be ready for people. I do not need a stage to be seen." His words toppled the frame of spectacle and pointed to a deeper truth. The CEO followed with a concrete action. He announced that day a company-wide policy change to invest in worker support programs, tuition assistance, and language classes. It was a small structural shift, but it was real. Some executives grumbled. Roger Bell issued a public statement about measured philanthropy. The board later accepted Martin's proposals after negotiation. The confrontation was not clean. It required compromise. It also required that people in positions of power be seen doing something messy and human. After the clamor waned, the narrative settled into an epilogue that tracked real change in concrete increments.
1 month later, the company had launched a pilot program that offered evening language classes and tuition reimbursement for maintenance staff. There was a small ceremony in the break room where Martin helped fold napkins and Kenji brought his thermos of matcha and a note he had written to his daughter. It was a moment of small, bureaucratic victory, and it smelled of coffee and new paper. 3 months later, Kenji received a letter from his daughter's school with a photograph of Emi at the shrine in Kyoto, wearing a borrowed kimono, bowing to elders, tasting the edge of a world Kenji had saved a path towards. The company had also published a short documentary about employee stories that featured several workers in maintenance, kitchen, and security. The tone was less glossy and more patient this time. 6 months later, a small foundation had been set up by employees to fund community learning initiatives with a board that included a janitor, a receptionist, and a mid-level manager. The foundation distributed micro-grants for neighborhood projects. Kenji watched Emi open an envelope with a list of classes she could take that year. She picked calligraphy. The world, at least in their small orbit, had shifted in increments that did not fix everything, but that made living gentler. The final weeks included reconciliations and complicities acknowledged. Roger Bell left the company and
a negotiated exit that left a residue of mixed opinions. Some colleagues praised him for protecting institutional stability, while others said he had been offered a chance to lead a new culture and had chosen caution. Cynthia, who had been nervous about optics, became an internal advocate for real narrative training rather than spin. She visited the maintenance crew and brought coffee and questions. She learned to listen without immediate translation. Harold found himself invited into new committees and used his experience as a union rep to ensure the voices of hourly staff were represented in policy discussions. Jenna built a series about people who performed dignity in public spaces, and it became a modest success. 3 distinct flashbacks had been woven into the narrative to give texture to the choices of the protagonists and to explain why they each moved the way they did. Kenji's childhood scene of folding cloths and learning a ritual of care explained his patience and quiet insistence on courtesy. Martin's memory of being laughed at for caring about workplace ergonomics illuminated his uneasy mix of compassion and fear. Cynthia's backstory of learning to spin narratives to survive contextualized her initial instinct to control the frame. Each flashback lasted the right amount to be felt as a memory rather than a full origin story, and each guided the present choices. The subplot of Emily's school trip functioned as both a motivation and a communal magnet. When employees pooled time and money, it became a small social experiment in solidarity that produced its own micropolitics and its own small scandals, like a miscount in funds that was quickly corrected by a volunteer spreadsheet and a phone call that soothed a miscommunication. There was a small technical description of how the crowdfunding was organized, a secure platform used by employees with a matched giving option from a corporate pool that adhered to compliance rules and ensured funds were traceable. That process, described in clear, accessible terms, helped the viewer understand that compassion often needs systems to make it sustainable. At the end of the telling, months after the mop had stopped the room, life returned to a rhythm with new notes. The janitor returned to his shifts, sometimes being greeted by people who had once passed without noticing him. His toolbox included a new company-issued thermos for matcha and a voucher for a class at the local community college. Martin walked through the atrium without a microphone and smiled in a way that had a new softness. His watch remained cracked, but his steps had a different cadence. Kenji continued to fold cloths with care and to teach Emi how to make small bowls of tea on Sundays. The locket, polished now by the touch of many hands, remained tucked against his chest. The final image is small and domestic. It is Kenji and Emi in their kitchen at dusk. Emi writes characters on a scrap of paper, while Kenji watches, his hand near hers. But not touching, that respectful space between teacher and child. The kettle clicks. The light through the window is a soft gold like the inside of a coin. Outside, the city continues to hum with its own large narratives, but inside there is a bowl of frothy green tea cooling on the table and the smell of toasted seaweed that the pair will share later. The camera pulls back and leaves them in a rectangle of ordinary light. If there is a question that lingers, it is simple. Who do we allow to be seen, and what does it cost us when we do not let people be visible? The story does not offer fixed answers, but it leaves a trail of practical consequences and small structural changes. It shows that rituals can be bridges, that silence can be powerful, and that a mop can be a kind of language if the world listens. If this story moved you, consider looking for small rituals in your everyday life and asking who they honor and who they exclude. If you want more stories like this, subscribe to the channel. We tell real stories about dignity and the ordinary gestures that ripple into something larger. Join a community that values listening more than spectacle. Click subscribe and bell to get notified when a new story is released. We read the comments and we use your stories to find people worth listening to. Share a short line starting with "My city" and one small thing that changed a big thing, and we might reach out because your story can inspire others. The last line repeats like a small prayer. The mop stopped the room, and in that stop, a world remembered how to bow.